Hey there, I'm Valerie Ling and I'm a clinical psychologist and I will be your host for Season two's episodes, which are all about the ministry kids' wellbeing down under. We asked 100 kids how they were doing and they gave us their answers. These are kids who are either serving with their families locally or overseas on the field. In this episode, you'll hear the main findings from the survey that we conducted. After that, each episode, I'll be talking to someone whom I think can help us to understand and unpack what the kids told us. Let's do it. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me again. I've got a special guest. His name is Marsden Sampson. G'day, Marsden.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Marsden has the unique perspective of having been in parish ministry with his family, as well as cross-cultural ministry. Correct, Marsden?
Correct.
Yeah. Take us through that timeline. Tell us a little bit about what your experience, like when have you been in as parish mission? Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, I was actually born while mum and dad were at Bible college, and then from the ages of day one until I was about 11, I was a pastor's kid, a minister's kid, at a couple of different churches. The last one was in Sylvania, where dad was the senior minister. And at about 10 or 11, mum and dad sat me down one night and said, "Hey, got some news. We are going to be missionaries."
Yeah.
And that then triggered a sequence of events that resulted in me jumping on a plane to go to Kenya about a year later. So it was a pretty quick turnaround.
Yeah. Yeah.
Turned 12 pretty shortly after arriving. So I think about a month into landing in Africa, I turned 12, and I was there until I finished school, where I came back ahead of my family for uni. And about 6 months later, they finished up in Kenya and came back to Australia, where dad became a minister again at a couple of different churches. And I'm no longer living at home, but dad is still in ministry. He now works for Bush Church Aid, BCA.
Yeah.
So he's still very much in full-time ministry.
That's right. I mean, you've left the nest.
That's it. I'm grown up now. Yeah.
Marsden, I have this lovely memory of, because you came and did an internship with us some years ago.
Yeah.
And you were probably one of the probably more my experience with you at that point in time was a missions kid, so adult kids who was reflecting with me because your exposure to our practice, and then you were, I think, reflecting on your experiences. And it's really lovely to kind of come full circle now and go, well, we've done this survey.
Yeah.
Now we get to hear, a few years on, your reflections. And I think it's pretty unique that you've had both perspectives. So my first question, Marsden, is just what stood out for you when you looked at the results, like reflecting on what the kids said and what you experienced?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that I'm sort of glad it picked up on was, and obviously these go hand in hand, but the loneliness and then the depression/anxiety. Because I think that has sort of probably been the biggest negative takeaway I've had from, I'd say, largely being a missionary kid. And a large part of that is both the culture shock and the reverse culture shock of coming home. So when I first moved back to Australia at 18, I went through this crazy period of, I landed on the Sunday and started uni on the Tuesday. I was living with cousins, but living out of home essentially for the first time, living in a new area of Sydney that I hadn't lived in, and having to figure out a whole bunch of things by myself. I've often explained it as I was an 18-year-old, but I was an 11-year-old Australian. So that sort of was my level of knowledge and understanding of the city that I was living in. In some ways it felt familiar, in other ways I had no idea where I was going and what I was doing. So yeah, that was a tough time, and that then led to a reasonably significant period of feeling pretty isolated and lonely, and definitely at points feeling pretty depressed. In my first 24 months back in Australia, I lived in 4 different homes.
Wow.
So that was, yeah, that was pretty challenging. That was a combination of um, living with my cousins and then a CMS provided house and then a different house. And then obviously dad being a minister, houses come with the job.
Mm,
So yeah, that was a pretty unstable time for me,
yeah.
which definitely led to periods of like I felt lonely and felt disconnected. Tied in with the fact that I didn't particularly love uni and that
Mm,
sort of structure. Going from a high school of um, 25 people per grade to the
mm,
big bad world of uni was a crazy transition.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so that was something I found really challenging. So when looking at the study and picking up on that, I went, yeah, okay, that's a big part of it. Um, and yeah, it doesn't surprise me that the stats are there.
So when I mean, almost half of the kids endorse some level of loneliness, and you can see that the average age is about age 12. So this would have been you before Kenya,
Mm,
and this idea that we have people when you're in ministry. There's always people.
yeah.
You know, your parents are around. If you have siblings, your siblings are around, and you're always in with some kind of activity where there's people. How does that link to loneliness then, do you think, Marsden?
Yeah, good question. I think despite the presence of lots of people, it doesn't always mean you feel connected to the people around you.
Mm,
Um, I remember particularly when Dad's been a minister, you sort of there seems to be people over at your house all the time. Um, but I'm definitely someone who I describe myself as a social introvert. Like I'm very very social and happy to be in that space. But at the end of the day, I like my sort of quiet time. Um, and so when you've got a house full of people, it's pretty easy to want to retreat from that a lot.
yeah,
Um, and a lot of the time, um, the the rectory is fairly close to the church physically. One of the ones we were at, it was literally shared a fence, and so you'd pull into your driveway and you can see everything happening at church, even though you're not at that service, you're not engaged in the youth group or whatever it is.
mm,
Um, that can feel pretty close and intense, and again potentially lead to wanting to feel the need to withdraw. Um,
mm,
I think another thing that potentially leads to uh, maybe feeling sort of lonely and isolated is particularly when you first started the church. You've been announced from the front. There was a slideshow a few weeks ago welcoming the new minister and his family. So everyone knows who you are,
yeah,
but you don't necessarily know who they are.
mm,
And what that can often result in is you they feel like they know you, and so there's maybe less effort
mm,
to welcome you into things, and because it's sort of almost the vibe of you're locked in straight away. Um,
yeah,
yeah, so that can be a tricky one as well.
yeah. I remember one kid put on their comments card. This is probably is a kid on the field. Is like there were hundreds or maybe even thousands of people with my photo on their fridge. It's just a weird
Yeah,
concept. Like
yeah,
people
yeah, yeah,
know you, know your name, and yet you don't. How does a kid connect with that dynamic? Hey.
yeah, for sure.
And what about them being able to relate to people at school? Can you get some of those friendship needs met, or is there a barrier there as well?
So my schooling in Australia and my schooling in Kenya have been quite different experiences. I've been blessed to have a fairly significant overlap with my school friends and church friends during my schooling in Australia. And so it felt part of that community because it, in a number of ways, felt like the one sort of community. I'd have the friends at school and would all go to youth group on a Friday together. Um, but in Kenya was a bit of a different vibe there. And I think it can be interesting going to another country where people live there and there's this weird sort of you've come to my country to help, and that can sometimes feel a bit I don't know, intrusive from their perspective. So despite being at a Christian school, there were like I remember having some conversations with people being like, "So what are you like? What is
Mm,
your family doing here? Like
yeah,
we're sort of fine. We don't really need this."
yeah,
Um, and so there can be a bit of like I don't know, a bit of a barrier there sometimes.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things you've just said in this piece is that having lots of people over or having lots of people know you and still feeling disconnected, and then there's this cycle then that you withdraw, hey,
Mm.
kind of pull back. Maybe you don't want to actually be in the spotlight, or try to be too open, because it's like, 100 people getting to know one of you.
Yeah.
One of the things that you were talking about was, as an older kid, coming back to Australia is not necessarily home. You left when you were 11, and then having to like go through this speeded learning.
Mm.
One of the things we picked up in the survey is that older kids, whether they're, in parish ministry or cross-cultural ministry, older kids feel the impact of being in ministry. What do you think that's about, Marsden, in reflecting on your own experiences?
Mm. Um, I mean, I think there's the general when you're a kid, sometimes it's a bit of a go with the flow. Um, Home is where mum and dad is, sort of thing.
Mm,
But as you get older, um, I think it's important that, particularly on the mission field, that there's buy-in from the kids as well,
mm,
um, and that there is this sense of we are doing it as a family.
mm,
And I think a lack of that leads to you've pulled me away from my home, mum and dad. You've dragged me to this place I don't want to be at.
mm,
You've put me in this school. You've disconnected me from my friends, had to leave a pet behind, whatever it may be. Um, and that can, depending on the buy-in from the kids, that can go one of two ways. They can feel like they're really connected to um, the missions work and feel like, no, this is us. We're doing this,
mm,
or it can feel like I don't want to be here. This is ruining my life.
mm,
This like aggressive, ripped out of my life at a young age. And I think the older you get, the more that second possibility tends to be more common. Like if you're 5, I don't know, maybe some 5-year-olds find it really hard, but there's probably more of that go with the flow. But if you're halfway through high school,
mm,
um, and I know some missions organisations actually have an upper limit on how old some of the kids can be because they go it's
mm,
too hard
mm,
with the kids, 15,
mm,
16. We had some friends on the mission field who they moved over there when their oldest was, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of 15, 16.
mm,
And he just found it so hard. Like he left behind a girlfriend and he only had 2 years left of high school. And so he was planning on where he was going to go to uni and college and whatever.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I think that led to this
yeah.
your missions thing, mum and dad, has destroyed my life. It's had a destructive effect rather than as a family, we're doing this thing. Yeah, that's sort of been my experience.
Maybe it's also because in that latter half of your adolescent years too, you're kind of needing some hope that the future has got some stuff where you're independent.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Right? Like you said, you might have some romantic relationships that are starting to blossom. You're starting to really want to just make your own way, and in a familiar space. I think some of the things that I've come across, not necessarily in our survey, but in reading adult TCK reflections, was just a sense that you couldn't even plan to know, like, if you really wanted to study a particular subject, that you would be able to get there,
Mm,
or that the schooling system would match up really well. And so, it's just, there isn't this positive forward sense. It's a little bit harder because, you've got all these complications
yeah,
to even get to independence or get to a future.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
And so it sounds like when you returned to Australia, that was a really hard time for you. What were some of the things that helped you, Marsden?
Um, yeah, I think there's an element of which it just takes time to
Mm,
um, reacclimate to what is a fairly new environment. Um, having a couple solid friendships that had um, lasted across my years in Kenya became really, really key. So I had a couple friends who, um, particularly the ones who'd come and visited us in Kenya, I found those to be really strong friendships when I got back.
mm,
But some people that I sort of kept in touch with over the years or reconnected with when I got back,
mm,
those friendships became really important. And I found myself really valuing
Mm.
one or two, three really close friends rather than just a whole sort of bunch of close-ish friends.
Mm.
Uh, and that became a significant part of my life, significant coping mechanism. I don't know how far you'd go.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, having those relationships where that felt sort of safe and secure, like
Mm.
it's lasted for a long time. So this,
Mm.
and
Mm.
also they felt like they knew me, particularly the ones that come
Mm.
and visited.
Mm.
Because I think one of the biggest isolating things is I would enter a space, be it a uni class or whatever. I'd look and sound Australian, but I had radically different history background, and so trying to relate with people, you get a classic question: "Oh, where'd you go to high school?"
Yeah.
You probably haven't heard of it. West Nairobi School in Kenya,
Yeah.
um, and half the people couldn't point to that on a map.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even when you're trying to make connections, it feels a bit isolating.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so definitely the close relationships of people who knew me and knew my experience
Mm.
was important.
Mm. And you've struck me as a reflective and insightful human being when I first met you. And I think I
Yeah.
wonder whether some of that is, all the moving and you have a greater awareness of the world, and you have to think through some things beyond what an average 11, 12, 14, 15 year old is. And I wonder if that also adds to, it can be then difficult to connect with peers, like whether you've been on a mission or you've moved around Australia and been in ministry. As an older kid, you probably get exposed to lots of preaching, lots of questions about life and culture and ethics. I wonder if that also adds to just, it's hard to connect with, the masses.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, there have been a number of challenging things about being a missionary kid, but one incredible part is I have seen so much of the world and seen people in radically different circumstances. I've experienced different cultures, languages,
Mm,
and I spent the first 11 years ish of my life in the Southern Shire, which is sort of an area known for being quite insular and
yeah,
not not experienced with the rest of the world. Um, yeah, so I often think how different my life would look and how different a person I would be had I not, been dragged halfway across the world at 11 years old.
yeah. And Marston, hard things happen in ministry. I also wondered whether for older kids, there is more of an awareness of the hard things that happen in ministry. Did you find that, because you've had all kinds of different ministry exposure now, but as an older kid, did you feel like, oh, I've got this stuff is bothering me personally? Was it like that for you?
Not so much me necessarily, but more as a broader affecting my family. Um,
Mm,
I think whether or not people remember this consciously or not, the people in ministry are real people with real emotions, and they have good days, they have bad days, but most significantly, they feel things when people give them a compliment, or unfortunately, feel things when people have negative things to say. Um, and so, yeah, there's definitely an element of, if dad had come home and he's cop some feedback about something he said in the sermon, whether he meant to or not, that then has a broader impact
mm,
on the family because I've seen dad, looking a bit down, and conversely as well, if he's had a great morning, you see that as well. Um, and there's probably an element to which the older you get, the more your parents sort of involve you in that,
mm,
or at the very least, you perceive more.
mm,
Yeah, I think particularly on our return to Australia and Dad's return to parish ministry, I was 19, 20. You're talking with your parents a lot
yeah,
more about sort of how work is going rather than just church being this thing where dad's the boss and I go to Sunday school and everyone knows me, which
yeah,
is the attitude you might have as a kid.
yeah, yeah. So, reflecting overall on your experiences, how has it shaped you to be the person that you are, that you feel good about, that you go, you know what? These are some things that I think have really shaped me, that I'm pleased about, Marsden.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as I mentioned before, the experiences I've had, um, the different cultures I've experienced has given me a very much more broad understanding of the world. And I think it's one of those things where the more you learn, the more you realize just how much you don't know, and how much of the world there is to explore. And so I'm grateful for those. I'm grateful for people I've met who are across the world who I've been able to do life with. Like it's not often that you meet someone who's been to school with people from 10 different countries. I am grateful for the reality check that I've experienced as a result of living in a third world country, and you see people in extreme poverty, and I find it helpful to remind myself of those experiences, particularly having lived in Sydney for the last 8 years. It's easy to get caught up in the hustle and bustle of this life and the things that really aren't that big a deal, like traffic being bad or internet being slow. Like it helps to put those things back into perspective. Yeah, and so I'm thankful that I have those experiences to fall back on, and a reminder, like, actually, you know what, this isn't so bad.
Yeah. And if we can speak some wisdom into the space of these kids who have answered these questions and told us all these things, what are some encouragements or some wisdom that you would give to them?
Yeah, I had an overall positive experience. There were definitely elements that were challenging, but I'm very thankful for my time in Kenya. And I think if I was to sort of talk to my younger self, as it were, or someone in a similar position, I would say, hey, like there's definitely going to be some tough bits, but you'll likely at the end of it all be thankful for the experiences you've had. I think in terms of wisdom, it's important to have your own faith, and to cherish that and invest in that, because that also leads to the buy-in from people as to what their parents are doing. Yeah, I think those are probably the big things where if you don't feel connected, often churches are one of the biggest sources of community. So that'd be another thing.
Yeah. And in terms of the faith community caring for kids, what would be something that you'd want us to learn so that we could care better, deeper, more for the kids?
Yeah. Particularly for missionary kids, I think the one of my little like pet peeves is the questions that missionary kids get asked. One of the more frustrating questions, I would say, is when someone is asked about their time living in another country in the same way that you would ask about a holiday. I lived in Kenya for 6.5 years, and when someone finds out that information, they'll go, "Oh, how was that?" In the same way that you'd be like, "I just went to, Europe for 3 weeks. Oh, how was that?" And so it's this really like tricky task to try and summarize my entire high school life, my entire experience in another country into this one word. Oh yeah, it's pretty good. So I think understanding that there's a huge story behind that, and I think also understanding that for a lot of missionary kids from Australia is not home. And I think that's a really common misconception that, oh, it must be so great to be back. It must be so good to see people again. But if you've got missionary kids who have lived in, the mission field for the majority of their life, potentially even speak the language and go to a local school there, that probably feels like home to them. And there's an element to which I had both Australia and Kenya, and I think that's a common thing. But you can have the mission field feel like home, and moreover, you can have the sending country, the home country, not feel like home. If you left Australia when you were really young and you're coming back as someone older, chances are, due to you being on the fridge of all these people, there's going to be lots of people who know you and you have no idea who they are. And so this misconception of, oh, it must be fantastic now that you're back. Like the mission field was somewhere sort of, it's implied that they wanted to leave. Whereas some kids are like, well, I can't wait to get back. Like I miss my friends, I miss my house, my room, my dog, whatever it may be. So I think understanding that is a pretty key thing for returning missionary kids, because I think if you get asked that question or someone says, oh, it must be so great to be back, I think that instantly goes, you don't quite get what I'm going through.
Actually, which makes me think of now deputation or home assignment, when missionaries come back to Australia and the kids come back as well. What are some things we need to be aware of when, we're seeing kids
Mm.
who are in Australia? This is not their home, and now they've got to put this little show and tell on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
We
it.
need to know about that.
At least in my experience, a lot of the churches that supported us and where our link church is, mum and dad has had connections with those people, but we didn't know them at all. And so you'd rock up and everyone would know who you are, and that mum and dad would be chatting away, and we're sort of sitting there like, okay, answering the same sort of questions like, oh, how was Kenya?
Mm,
Um, so I think that's sort of good to recognize. The other thing is that we had 9 churches. So by the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th church, we've heard dad do the same sermon. We've watched the same video. We've seen the
mm,
same slideshow. And we've
mm,
been asked by, members of the church the exact same questions.
mm.
That's a pretty taxing thing, particularly for, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old.
Yeah.
Um, it's also, generally a pretty big day if there are multiple services, and it's a good chunk of the weekend um, gone for a kid. So that's a significant thing. Um, but at the same time, on a less sort of negative note, I have very sort of positive memories of some churches where the reception was awesome and people just like took us under their wing straight away. And because it can be intimidating, be like, oh, hey, everyone, this is the missionary kid, look and stare, and make them go to the kids' church and get up the front and ask them questions. Um, but there were fun ones where they would get in contact with us ahead of time and request something, and they really just met us where we're at. And so there was ones where I had this trivia prepared, so I ran a trivia for Sunday school and played games and stuff. And that for me, I was like, oh, okay, this is really cool. Yeah, so I think that's a great way to do it, at least from my experience.
So is it kind of like engaging with you and having your input and figuring out what it is that could make it meaningful?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I know that there have been kids that have come throughout the practice where we've actually even asked, like, is there a way that they can be excused from some bits of it? Like, is there a way to kind of, like, could a grandparent come along, for example, so that they have someone to hang with
Yeah.
and feel like they're actually not, because I think you're right, like nine, if you're going around to 9 different places, I don't know that I'd be able to do it. I think I
Yeah, it's a pretty
do.
pretty big task.
Yeah. Um, what sorts of encouragements might you have for parents? Because I've said it in other episodes. I don't want us parents, and I say us because I've also got adult ministry kids who are still making sense of their experiences
Mm.
and reviewing the parenting. What sort of encouragement can we go about the things that are, this really made the difference for you, and that parents can hear it and say, okay, that's not too hard for us to do. What would that be, do you think, Marsden?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've turned out okay.
Yeah.
Um, so at least one of us has, managed to scrape through being both a minister's kid and a missionary kid, and come out on the other side seemingly okay. I think understanding that it's going to be different for each of us. So I have 2 sisters,
Mm,
and we went to the same school. We're in Kenya for the same amount of time, give or take, but had fairly different experiences at different points. A large part of that was due to friendship groups or how we were going with school. And so you can have kids from the same family walk away from the same experience with different experiences. But in terms of like encouragement, I think all all 3 of us, my 2 sisters and I, have walked away with a journey of some challenging bits, but mostly good bits. And the 3 of us look back on our time in Kenya positively, to the point where a couple of years ago we went back and visited because it was something that we really wanted to you know go back to and experience again, even though there weren't many people there that we still were connected with. In terms of being a minister's kid, there have been some great highlights as part of that as well. Being able to sort of, I don't know, join a church and get stuck into serving straight away because people sort of know who you are. And yeah, that's been a highlight for sure.
And Marsden, why don't we do a free plug for you, hey? So you're onto some great professional things now. Would you like to
Yeah,
share with our audience on any given day where they can find you for work? For
yeah.
Yep.
So I'm one of the owners at a gym in Gladesville called Vision Personal Training, where I work with clients doing primarily weights training, but also dealing with nutrition and education in that space and accountability. I work with clients who are trying to improve their health, be it through weight loss or through um, getting stronger, getting fitter. And I have a team of personal trainers that work under me, and so I'm sort of training them up as well to have their own clients.
I think that that's pretty impressive that I'm sure it'll be a whole other podcast episode about how your experiences have led you to have, I think, the courage to jump into something like that and to be able to have the types of people skills, risk tolerance, but also empathy for the kinds of struggles that people have based on all of your experiences. I'm pretty certain that if we asked you, we'd be able to find it.
Absolutely. Actually, if I could add another bit of encouragement from a previous question, you just sort of
Yeah.
triggered a memory. I'm very thankful for the interactions I've had intergenerationally. So, as a result of going to a church, but even sort of multiple churches in deputation, I interacted with the kids in Sunday school and the teenagers in youth group and parents in morning church and the grandparents in morning church, and that has developed a real sort of ability to interact with people of different backgrounds and different ages. And that's something I reflect on now as my job involves, I say often my job is talking to people, because I'm dealing with clients ranging from 16 to 66.
I just have to say, and you're just great. I think there's a lot about you that is warm and humble and genuine and curious and kind and compassionate. When you meet someone, and I remember thinking to myself, I think at that stage, you might have only been 18 or 19 at that stage, but your honesty in the way that you were reflecting about what you were experiencing and trying to make sense of it, I think that's you. So I've been so pleased to have a chat with you. And thanks so much for taking the time, Marsden. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you liked what you heard and you think others should hear it too, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Catch you later.